Is everybody ready? Good. Well, I'm Mark Busby. I'm the moderator of this event. I'm a professor of English here at Texas State. And it's a special event for me, partially because I was a freshman in college in fall of 1963. And remember vividly, as everyone who was alive and conscious, and still conscious, remembers that moment as I was walking across campus at my small East Texas college, and someone drove by in a pickup and yelled, "Kennedy's been shot." And then it was, I'm not sure, what time was he declared dead? About 1 in the afternoon, early enough that I left Commerce and drove through Dallas on the way to my home at Ennis. And then it was an amazing event to see special editions of the Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald already available by 3:30 to 4 o'clock. Would be a non-event today, but it was a significant one. And now I see that there are facsimiles of that edition that you can buy for $3 or $4 almost anywhere. But my hometown, as I said, 20 miles, maybe 30 from Dallas in those days. And after that event, when someone asked me where I was from, rather than saying I was from a small town 20 miles south of Dallas, I would say I'm from a small town 200 miles north of Houston. And I think that these guys mentioned just how that happened in the book. So we're here to talk about Dallas, 1963. Let me tell you something about our authors. Bill Minutaglio here in the center. His work has appeared in the New York Times, in Esquire, and Newsweek, and Texas Monthly, and Outside, and many other publications. He's worked for the Morning News, the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle, the San Antonio Express News, and is the author of several critically acclaimed books, including biographies of George W. Bush, Molly Ivins, Alberto Gonzales, a book on Texas blues, and a narrative retelling the greatest industrial disaster in American history. And I'll pause for a moment for those of you who are old enough to maybe remember it. The title of the book is City on Fire, about the cataclysmic explosion in Texas City in 1947. He's a clinical professor of journalism, and I have to ask him what a clinical professor of journalism does at the University of Texas at Austin. He holds the Everett Collier Centennial Chair in the College of Communication. He received the 2011 Regents Outstanding Teaching Award by the University of Texas System. He's married to a dancer in choreography, Holly Williams, so you'll just have to imagine him here on the dance floor. He lives in Austin. His co-author, Steve Davis, on the end, is the author of 2 highly praised books on Texas culture, Texas Literary Outlaws, and his recent biography of famed Texas writer J. Frank Dobie. His work has appeared in Texas Monthly, Texas Observer, San Antonio Express News, Southwestern American Literature, Texas Books and Review. I became aware of Steve's great work many years ago when I directed his thesis on literature of South Texas. He's a longtime curator here at the Whitliff Collections and has been responsible for many of the great exhibits here, ones on Carmen McCarthy, Sam Shepard, and many others. He lives in New Braunfels, Texas. He grew up in Dallas. I'm not sure if Steve can dance. All right.
No.
His wife Georgia is here. She can confirm that. Let me begin by reading some of the reviews of this book, not the whole reviews, just some of the comments, because it's already received significant acclaim and will continue to, I'm sure. Publishers Weekly, in a starred review, said, after 50 years, it's a challenge to fashion a new lens with which to view the tragic events of November 22nd, 1963. Yet Texans Minutaglio and Davis pull it off brilliantly. Other comments from Douglas Brinkley, one of the more famed professors of history, been at UT and at Rice and at Louisiana. writes this, Bill Minutaglio and Stephen L. Davis's Dallas 1963 is a brilliantly written, haunting eulogy to John F. Kennedy. By exposing the hatred aimed at our 35th president, the authors demonstrate that America, not just Lee Harvey Oswald, was ultimately responsible for his death. Every page is an eye-opener, highly recommended. And Lawrence Wright, famed Austin writer of The Looming Tower, and more recently Going Clear, writes, all the great personalities of Dallas during the assassination come alive in this superb rendering of a city on a roller coaster into disaster. History has been waiting 50 years for this book. And Gary Cartwright, another famed Texas writer whose works are housed in this archive, writes, Minutaglio and Davis capture in fascinating detail the creepiness that shamed Dallas in 1963. And Robert Draper, another important Texas writer for Texas Monthly, writes, in this harrowing, masterfully paced depiction of a disaster waiting to happen, Minutaglio and Davis examine a prominent American city in its own now infamous moment of temporary insanity. Because these days of partisan derangement look all too familiar today, Dallas 1963 isn't just a gripping narrative. It's also a somber, cautionary tale. And Dan Rather, I think you may have heard of, says this, the book is first-rate reporting and writing, may be the best book about the JFK assassination this year. So those are some of the things. Steve, do you have something?
I just wanted to add that my mother gave it a good review also.
Yes, I have that one here.
I don't know if that's exactly accurate, Steve.
She said she kind of liked it, really. Well, I thought since some of you here, I know, are not completely familiar with the book. I know some of my students are here for extra credit and may not know about it. I thought I'd ask the two of you maybe to just say a little bit about what the book is about beyond what those blurbs said. So maybe, Bill, why don't you tell what you think it's about, and Steve can correct you.
I think that's been our pattern, by the way. But I could tell you what a clinical professor is not. I'm not able to write prescriptions. So much to my disappointment, I found that out. And I can't dance either. So. Our book is about Dallas, 1963. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's really about the years, 3 to 4 years before November of 1963 and the fateful day when Kennedy came to Dallas. And it's about a confederacy, sort of this convergence of, I call them negative superlatives. I don't know what Steve calls them, but a number of people, an intense minority, let's call them, had begun emerging in Dallas to create a very vitriolic, we thought, atmosphere that ran counter, I think, to the larger feelings in the city about Kennedy. There were tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of folks in Dallas who either loved Kennedy or, at the minimum, respected the office. And what we decided to take a look at was what happened in the years prior to Kennedy arriving, where we think a handful of folks, these negative superlatives, powerful people who lived above the cloud line and could afford to hijack the microphone, the civic dialogue, and sort of at first independently and then in a more coordinated fashion over time began to almost objectify the city, from the outside looking in as a city of hate. I don't think it was, and Steve might argue with me, but or debate that point or agree. I don't know, but we wanted to take a look at these very interesting people who were again just almost cinematic in their quality, very, very powerful, very influential, and in different quadrants, from the pulpit, from the top of the office towers, people who had kind of the keys to the media in the city, and then, of course, political figures. And again, a small handful of people really created what we maintain, and I'm heavily biased in this regard. I think we both are. They created a singular environment, not just at that time period, but I think really in American history. It was nothing like it. I think we've wrestled a lot with why it happened to be in Dallas as opposed to other places. And I think we came to some conclusions. You'll have to read the book to get to it, but that's hopefully a good description. But Steve can correct me, as he often does.
No, I agree, of course. And, I think really what sort of attracted us to this subject is, well, in part, these kinds of bits of mythology that we'd heard over the years growing up in Texas. Was it really true that the publisher of the Dallas Morning News went into the White House and confronted JFK personally and told him, "We need a man on horseback to lead this country. And too many of us in Texas and the Southwest think you're riding Caroline's tricycle." And that's one example of the negative superlatives. You also had the congressman in Dallas who repeatedly called Kennedy a traitor to his country, led a mob attack that we can talk about a little bit more that really defined Dallas in very negative terms across the country. And you had the wealthiest man in the world, H.L. Hunt, who was using his fortune to bankroll these attacks against Kennedy and against Kennedy's agenda. I'll just mention one example here. It was John F. Kennedy who proposed Medicare in 1963. And that idea didn't really go over too well in Dallas. The Dallas Morning News said that the program sounded suspiciously like what the communists were trying to do in Russia. You had the congressman in Dallas, Bruce Alger, go onto the floor of the House of Representatives and say that this would represent basically the end of America as we know it. The country would fall apart. And H.L. Hunt, his radio program that he funded called Lifeline, was heard on hundreds of stations across the country by millions of people. And Lifeline made it a special project of theirs to oppose Medicare. And their announcer basically said that Medicare would lead to government death panels, that this diabolical plan literally makes the President of the United States a medical czar with life or death power over each individual citizen. And, these kind of scare tactics that people in Dallas were whipping up worked. Medicare failed. And it failed largely because of the people in Dallas. Of course, it did pass later with LBJ, but it was just part of this kind of environment that we were really looking at. And I'll say, too, that a lot of that, we all had this kind of vague notion growing up in Texas that Dallas had been evil in some way, that there was a reason people blamed it for Kennedy's murder, even though a communist had shot the president. But that's how everybody in America felt at the time. Well, not everybody, but across the country, you would see all of these denunciations of Dallas. And over the years, that history has really been lost to us. It's become kind of obscured by all the conspiracy theories, and the same people who once opposed Kennedy, later began praising him as a great president and so forth. So a lot of that really got lost, and that was really kind of the story we wanted to do, really to go back and show what it was really like at that time. And again, the parallels to today are pretty remarkable, really.
It's always interesting to readers to find out something about how co-authors work. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, whether you each took different chapters, whether you sat down in a room together and hashed out every sentence, or just how you decided the distribution of labor to write this particular book.
I'm going to jump in first because I really want to flatter Steve here on his home turf with all of his colleagues and friends here. Steve's a genius. I'm not, so that's how we started. I had a lot of catching up to do.
I said the same thing at Bill's place at UT. Just FYI.
Dang. I hope there's no YouTube of that, but Steve's kind of sort of right. But that's why we work so well together. But honestly, Steve, I got to know Steve a few years ago when he was gracious enough to ask me to take a look at some old stories that I had written many years ago for different publications in Texas, and then essentially published it. He published it through the Whitliff Collections, through the Southwest Writers Series, under the auspices of UT Press, and I was very lucky to come here and talk about it. And so I'm predisposed to like Steve anyway. He saw something in some old stories that had been really tucked away, covered with cobwebs, so I knew he had good taste. But then, as we just got to be friends as a consequence of that, we began talking about things that we thought maybe had been neglected in Texas, or forgotten, as Steve just said. over time, and we kept coalescing and talking more and more about Dallas because Steve was from there and I had worked there. I used to sit in the Dallas Morning News building, and if I craned my neck this way, I could see the assassination site. It was there every day. In fact, when I first moved to Dallas, I moved into a rent-by-the-week motel, waiting for my wife to move down. I don't think she was happy I was in the rent-by-the-week motel, but it happened to be about 2 blocks away from the assassination site. Every morning, I would walk by the assassination site, and I began thinking, I always felt that the site should have been hermetically sealed. A big bubble should have been put over it. It seemed strange to me that it was so publicly available. And then Steve and I began talking a little bit about this, and then talking about the things that we thought were in the shadows. Again, intentionally forgotten, maybe just forgotten over the course of time, 50 years, and what story we could tell that was original and unique and worth telling. That's our story, and sticking to it. I know it sounds kind of pious, but that's really, that was our motivation. What else could be told? And what was it, I think, that Steve and I both were feeling, was missing? And what we wanted to do was take a look at the marrow, the DNA of the history of that time period, really almost do some forensic work and try to figure out why Dallas did get that reputation, albeit perhaps forgotten. But we knew was sort of there, and to answer finally your question, you say I need a good editor, we just kicked it back and forth. I mean, Steve might describe the process. We really locked pretty early into a rhythm. I had co-authored a book with someone else before, but I hope he's not here. Yeah, this one went a lot more smoothly, and that detective work will allow you to narrow that down. But no, that book went very well. This was a different dynamic where I think it was a truly equal partnership, and we just kicked it back and forth. I'm not a musician. I'm a failed musician, but I imagine it being like successful, actually, songwriting to me, or at least fulfilling songwriting. We would just riff on things, come to ideas, write things, and just email it. Steve would email it up to Austin. I'd send it back to New Braunfels, where Steve lives, and we just kind of figured it out. I don't think it was.
We just go back and forth with the
Yeah,
drafts, basically.
I don't think it was any.
That part was pretty smooth.
Too much dark art involved. Yeah.
So you didn't, I mean, the book is organized chronologically, so you didn't say, I'm going to take 1960 and you take 1961, and then we'll both do 62 and 63, or?
Well, we each kind of had different strengths going into the book as far as the subject area we were most familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of divided some of that up in the beginning, but it's sort of like, I think about Bud Shrake and Dan Jenkins, two Texas authors who co-wrote a novel, and by the end they couldn't tell who had written what sentence, and I think a lot of ours is like that. It came out to be a pretty nice blend. The only thing I felt bad about is last time Bill came to my house, I had forgotten to take down that dartboard that had his face on it. And I still feel really bad about that.
No, I don't know if you saw, I had put it in the trash after you had stepped out into the kitchen, but it was actually really fun. I mean, it was, there were some, I guess we were on the tricycle too, trying to figure it out. And Steve said it really well. We just sort of played to our strengths. There were a few things that maybe I felt that I knew about because I had been a reporter in Dallas for 20 years, and Steve was like, well, I can go further back. I grew up there. So, but we kind of figured it out, and it took on a rhythm. I structurally, if it matters to any of the compositional folks out there, hopefully your students, that we did go through a process of deciding really how to write it. And again, I'm going to flatter Steve. It's easy to do. Steve is an unbelievable researcher, a beautiful writer. The depth and quality of his research is just unbelievable. I know of no finer researcher than this guy right here. So that makes it easy. I teach journalism. I'm a clinical professor, not of pharmacy, but of journalism. So I always teach, that to write effectively, to write nonfiction effectively, you have to have really deep reporting. The reporting drives the writing. It makes it so much easier to sling around the adverbs and adjectives. And each day, it seems, Steve would just come with these nuggets that were from the Earth's core, just revelations. There's a lot of original material in the book. There really is. We're heavily biased, but I'm just my story, and I'm sticking to it. There really are some revelations. Steve had a magical ability to grab things from the past 50 years ago, buried in archives, stuff that had never been seen, but I think really should have been seen by historians. So then we had it all out on the table. The forensic, composition began, and we had some kind of cool discussions. I think I like them. I'm a writing nerd, but I liked talking about whether we should use present tense, which is a decision that we made. And a lot of people think that's playing with fire, when you're writing journalism or history. But we talked a lot about that and whether that was the right technique. And then even, as you noted, thank you, the chronological exposition of the book, it is narrative. It begins in 1960, and then month by month we march up to November of '63. And that was a deliberate decision, born out of some healthy discussion. I think there was one moment, maybe when it was 195 degrees in July, when we might have gotten terse via email. And I don't know. Is that that's,
I don't remember.
You don't remember? Yeah. Okay. I exiled it to culture deprogramming occurred or something.
Steve, could you comment on the decision to write in present tense? What do you think you gained by writing in present tense?
Well, this, for anybody who really would care enough to look, you could examine my writing before I began working with Bill and then whatever I've written after that and see how much it's improved. Because I learned so much from this man about the writing process and really how to build narrative. I thought, I was flattering myself thinking, oh, well, as an academic writer, I'm relatively accessible. And I didn't realize kind of how academic I was until I began to work with Bill, who really would hone in on what was actually happening in terms of, the character and just the progression of the plot and so forth. And really letting the readers do some of the work to put the pieces together instead of always laying everything out there like a big buffet. Mm-hmm. And so there's that. And I think the present tense, at some point, and Bill can elaborate on this, but in terms of looking what was going on in the early 1960s and seeing how intense these battles were against John Kennedy and how riled up people were, and actually brought a little prop to share with you all. Here's one example of what you would see in Dallas. Anybody notice anything unusual about this flag?
Distress.
Why is it upside down? It's the signal of a nation in distress. I have a neighbor in New Braunfels who flies his flag upside down today, as a matter of fact. And people in Dallas were taking these and waving them around because they were sure that John F. Kennedy was going to turn the country over to the United Nations. And when you're writing about kind of such heated moments, it at some point just made sense to just kind of plunge into the moment and tell the story from that perspective.
I'd add too, if you just I'll boil it down to a minute. I think I was saying this the other day when I was talking about the book somewhere else that I wanted my children to read it. I don't know if my daughter's here yet. She's 20 years old. I think she was trying to come on up. I saw a hand go up back there. So I think she's waving at me or telling me to cut it out or something. But I really think that what happened in Dallas back then was so important, and it's stuff that we shouldn't forget. The stuff that everything, and I'm biased, so I wanted people to reflect on what we wrote about, of course, because I do believe that a lot of the same tendencies are occurring today. People are polarized and they're yelling at each other, and I don't know about you, I'm sick and tired of it. I think a lot of folks are, just the screaming, and it seemed to be born. It was really born. This almost public manifestation of it, the hijacking again of the microphone was occurring in Dallas. And I could argue that point that was really the first full kind of modern media manifestation of it. And so I kind of, in a selfish level, wanted, my family and my daughter, who's 20, to read it, and as she filters the news today, to think about where it might have had its genesis, this polarization, this vitriol, this objectification of people, the screaming matches on cable. So that was one motivation, I think, I wanted it to be readable. I think we wanted it to be readable. And present tense sometimes has a more zippy quality, and we wanted people to turn the page, and so that as people could relate to it, that it was gripping, the story would be gripping. So there's a coldly craven, practical plan of attack in the writing, but then as well, as Steve was saying, there were unbelievably spiked dramatic moments. In the year of 1963, just that year alone, one of the years we looked at, in January of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King, against all odds really, he had been warned, don't go to Dallas. Let that settle for a second. You know, don't even go to Dallas. Dallas had remained the largest American city to still remain segregated in its public schools. He made a courageous decision to go to Dallas, and what happened, there was a bomb threat lodged against him. I don't know that that's been reported a whole lot, even in King histories, books written about King, and we were glad to write that story, that episode, which was chilling to me. It scared me when we found out about it. It scared me when we were writing it, but it seemed to need the propulsive quality of being in the moment. If that makes sense. We really wanted it to be living history so that you would feel maybe the same fear and the anxiety that even Dr. King would feel going to Dallas. A few months later, the guy in Dallas who was most famous for flying this flag upside down, General Edwin Walker, he was the titular head of the anti-Kennedy movement in America, a defrocked major general. He got booted out of the military for trying to brainwash his troops into believing that Eleanor Roosevelt was a socialist or a communist, and that Harry Truman was a socialist or a communist. When he got booted out of the military, he moved straight
By Kennedy.
By Kennedy.
Relieved of command by Kennedy. Yeah.
moved straight to Dallas. He could have chosen to live anywhere in the world, but he moved to Dallas, began flying this thing out in front of his house in a pretty nice part of town off of Turtle Creek Boulevard in Dallas, if you know that part of town. And in April of '63, not long after someone lodged a bomb threat against Dr. King in his visit to Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald crept into an alleyway behind the general's mansion and waited till the general appeared in his study, sat at his desk, and then tried to kill him with a headshot. He rested a rifle on a little notch in a fence in the alleyway and came within a whisker of assassinating former Major General who many Americans who hated Kennedy were proposing as a possible presidential candidate against Kennedy.
He was the man on horseback.
He was the man on horseback. So I'm using these illustrations as perhaps why we chose to write in present tense. That kind of scary, cinematic, again, almost sounds craven, but that kind of action we thought really needed to be portrayed as vigorously as possible, and that led to some present tense usage.
You've already sort of mentioned some of them. My next question was of all these people, then you talk about a lot of them. You just mentioned General Walker. And I was wondering which one each of you found the most interesting to you. Maybe Walker is to you, if not, maybe your second one, and then Steve can tell me.
Well, for me, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Steve.
For me, it was Stanley Marcus, who you may know was the president of Neiman Marcus, which was founded in Dallas by his family. And Stanley had a very ambivalent life in Dallas. He was the merchant prince who brought cosmopolitan sophistication and splendor to the city of Dallas. He brought Coco Chanel, Sophia Loren. He consorted with European royalty, and he made a lot of money catering to all these new oil millionaires. And basically, this was a time when Dallas was trying to lure companies from the Northeast to resettle down in Dallas where there was low tax base and so forth. And Stanley Marcus's emporium really helped make the sell in a lot of ways. And Stanley had this vision for Dallas that it would become kind of an international city. He was very involved in the United Nations. He founded the Dallas Council on World Affairs. So you'd see him in the paper almost every week with some visiting royalty, having his picture taken for some talk and so forth. So he had this life here that he built for himself. And at the same time, his store, Neiman Marcus, was segregated. African Americans could go into the store, they could shop in certain places. They could even buy shoes, but they could not return those shoes, whereas white customers could. They were not allowed to shop in the bridal department. They could not eat in the restaurant at Neiman Marcus. And Stanley Marcus was not happy about that. He wanted his store to be segregated. He was not able to do that in Dallas, and it's easy to blame somebody for that now. But when we're looking at his archives, you could see he was a member of this all-powerful Dallas Citizens Council, a group of 50 men who basically ran affairs in the city. And he had been basically lobbying them for years to integrate Dallas, and he just got blown off time after time after time. And socially, he could just not take that first step himself. And as you'll see in the book, he eventually was able to help shift some of the levers of power, and integration happened very peacefully. But I'll just kind of tell quickly one other story that really brought home this unusual position that Stanley Marcus found himself in. There are actually quite a few in the book, but he's a guy who was very close to Lyndon Johnson, and he, like LBJ, were both sort of closet civil rights advocates. They could not really come forth in Texas at that time and say they believed in equality. But they understood each other, and Stanley was a big supporter of Lyndon. Lyndon was a big shopper at Neiman Marcus. We saw in the archives where Lyndon had ordered a monogrammed bathrobe and returned it because the letters LBJ were not large enough to suit his taste. So, and Stanley Marcus, was friends with Eisenhower. He was friends with Kennedy. I mean, he was very well plugged in. He was really the most famous person in Dallas before the crazies kind of took over. And he was very quietly supporting the Kennedy-Johnson ticket in Dallas. He sponsored a luncheon for them. And what happened is, it was really vital that Kennedy and Johnson win Texas in order to win the 1960 election. It was really coming down to Texas and Illinois. And Kennedy was behind in the polls in Texas. And that was because the Democrats had the strongest civil rights plank ever as part of its platform. And that caused people who adhered to the Southern tradition in Texas, particularly at the Dallas Morning News and other places in Dallas, to whip up huge resentment against Kennedy and Johnson. And LBJ came to Dallas 4 days before the 1960 election to try to drum up some votes and help carry the state. And he was met by the congressman that I alluded to earlier, Bruce Alger, who had brought together a mob of the city's best-dressed citizens, holding signs saying, Judas Johnson, LBJ traitor, things like that. Bruce Alger had his own picket sign that said, LBJ sold out to Yankee socialists. And many of the crowd were dressed in business suits. Many of the women were wearing mink coats. And so it sort of gained this place in history as the mink coat mob, right on the eve of the 1960 election. And Stanley Marcus walked out of Neiman Marcus that day to go join LBJ for this lunch. And guess who he saw confronting him on the streets of downtown Dallas? His best customers were there protesting against Johnson. And he had to cross that picket line in order to join LBJ. And we think he probably hesitated just for a moment, but he did cross the picket line. And that really galvanized him and led to a lot of great work that he did on behalf of what you would call maybe the rational people in Dallas. And I'll just say about that mink coat mob. People were waving these picket signs. People were spitting on Lyndon and Lady Bird. People were pulling pins out of their hats and poking people. Somebody got a broken nose. Another woman had a broken arm. And it was really kind of a riot. And the television cameras were there and took in the entire scene of Lyndon and Lady Bird being accosted by these crazy people in Dallas. And it played on the evening news across the country. And nobody really minded seeing Lyndon roughed up by a crowd, even though it was kind of unprecedented in our modern age. But seeing Lady Bird subjected to such treatment, a Southern lady, really upset people. And it caused this massive backlash. There was a huge shift towards Johnson and Kennedy in Texas. And they ended up winning the election by about that much, less than a half of a percentage point in Texas. And so what's amazing about this story is the people in Dallas who set out to stop Kennedy and Johnson actually caused their election through their actions.
It's just unbelievably ironic considering what happened in November of 1963. There are some folks, some historians who suggest that, as Steve said, that was the tipping point for the 60 election, this attack, this vitriol, violence. Several people did go to the hospital. The police couldn't control it. And they saw Dallas, getting unhinged, and that they voted. Some folks voted in sympathy for the Kennedy-Johnson tickets, catapulted him to the White House, backfired in a big way, and then that was the beginning, perhaps, of the Kennedy presidency, and then the conclusion was in '63.
And let me just say quickly too that we talk about these little finds in the archives. Bill and I were both surprised that the mink coat mob is sort of a footnote in history, but it's not really talked about a lot. A lot of historians haven't really given it the credit it deserves in that really close election. But we saw that one political observer did recognize the importance of this moment in Dallas, and that was Richard Nixon. After he was president in 1968, you can hear the Oval Office recording of him talking to one of his political advisors, and he says, Well, we lost Texas in 1960, you know, because of that asshole congressman in Dallas. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I
no,
wanted to
no,
get that
yeah.
story in there.
You were channeling Richard Nixon there, so
my best.
scared me. It was the way you said it.
Such sincerity, huh?
Steve is not a crook. The thing we keep mentioning this figure, Bruce Alger, Congressman Bruce Alger. Some folks, again, in terms of a negative superlative, considered him the most strident, extreme member of Congress. And forgive me if you already said this, Steve, but that he had been infamous for being the lone member of Congress, the lone lawmaker on Capitol Hill to vote against a surplus milk program for needy children in America. There had been some leftover milk, and somebody said, why don't we give it to poor kids? And he said he was the only one from either side of the aisle, so there were a lot of conservatives and a lot of liberals who coalesced around the notion that it might be a good idea to give away that free milk. But he said it was socialism and it was communism to give away milk. And he was the guy leading the mink coat. Stanley was in a pickle. He sold a lot of those mink coats to a lot of those folks who were there. And I considered him a spy. He was a fascinating figure to write about and to think about. And a man possessed with great ambivalence. These were his customers. It was his bread and butter. They paid for the success that he had, and yet he had to try behind the scenes to do what he thought he could to advance Dallas to another stage, or at least change the hearts and minds of the handful of folks who were resisting change.
So Steve sort of identified Stanley Marcus as
Okay.
his. Is it yours as well, the most interesting one? Or the,
No, well, they're all everyone is more fascinating than the other, as you will learn as you buy many copies of our book. But
available outside here after this.
in the trunk of my car as well, down in the parking garage. I kind of liked. I do like them all, of course, but the one that I gravitated to because I worked in the same building that he had been in for a long time was Ted Dealey, the publisher of the Dallas Morning News. Dealey Plaza is pretty famous, I would imagine, for a lot of folks. It's right near where Kennedy was assassinated. It's one of the iconic places, I think, probably in American history, or names. Dealey Plaza just resonates. Triple underpass, school book depository, Dealey Plaza, they're all right there. And so Dealey Plaza was named for Ted Dealey's dad, George Bannerman Dealey, who was a crusading publisher of the Dallas Morning News in the early part of the 20th century, and probably most famous for chasing the national headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan out of Dallas. And I often like to try to let that settle for a second, because it wasn't in another, quote, southern state that the national headquarters of the KKK had been in. It had been in Texas, and particularly in Dallas, and really public. They had these real aggressive displays and parades and so on. And so George Bannerman Dealey, for many reasons, one being that it just simply wasn't good for the city's image and by extension business, kind of chased him out of town through the power of the good power of the media. And his son had helped him do that as a reporter. But as he took control of the newspaper from his dad, Ted Dealey, I think began to see things quite a bit differently. And I think he got reacquainted with the thing that Steve mentioned, quote, Southern traditions. That, in fact, he was a product of the age when the Brown v. Board of Education decision came down from the Supreme Court ordering that schools be desegregated around the nation. And Ted Dealey didn't like it. He just simply didn't like it. He was wedded to Southern traditions. And I'll tell you this, I don't think I've been more scared than sitting in the archives at SMU, DeGoyer Library, reading his papers alone. It looks a little like Hogwarts there, for you fans of kind of dark, burnished things. And I don't know if there were gargoyles, but it felt like there were some that were flying down off the ledge. But I was reading his papers and thus really trying to see inside his mind so that we could authentically write in the present tense, so that we could really, stick to the truth and tell the story through the words and even thoughts of the people that dominate our book. And it scared me to know what he was thinking and what he was saying. He was using some pretty colorful language, racially charged language. And he was the most powerful publisher in this part of the country, I maintain. And through his editorial pages, this launched this anti-Kennedy attack. And it reached a true, full realization in 1961, as Steve mentioned earlier, when he was invited to the White House and basically wagged his finger at Kennedy. He was invited up to Washington as part of one of these meet and greet the president luncheons that go on maybe right now with President Obama. And he went up there, but chose very deliberately. We saw this great material in his archives. He stayed up all night long, really almost feverishly scratching out notes on hotel stationery about what he was going to say to Kennedy when he finally got in a room with him. And he just basically wagged his finger at him and began yelling at him and called him a little kid, and that he was on bended knee to socialism. And he was, a little kid like his daughter riding a tricycle. What I found even more fascinating in the archives, and I hope Steve did too, was that there was evidence that the personal animus had gone to another level. That when he got back home, Ted Dealey got back home from Dallas after visiting the White House, he launched an investigation into Kennedy's personal life. He thought that President John Kennedy had had a secret marriage, that he had once been married before, and that the might and power of the Kennedy dynasty had somehow or other redacted all of this old information, this paperwork, or made it disappear. The marriage records, he was convinced that Kennedy had been married before. He had a secret other life. And it was a conspiracy theory that was swirling around that I think, some folks, have, as they read our book, have said, gee, that sounds a little like, some of the thoughts that some people have about President Obama and where he was born. And, is there some paperwork that fell off the back of the truck or was stolen or burned or tucked away? And I don't know. I'm not trying to make a political statement. I'm just making a repertorial observation, I hope. But Ted Dealey was obsessed with the thought that Kennedy had been married before, and he ordered his own reporters. I'm glad I didn't work there at the time, because I would have been saddled with the boss telling me, come on, Bill, I want you to investigate this rumor that the President of the United States has a secret marriage. So he was operating on many different levels. Fascinating to me, and maybe I'm biased because I worked in that building. I saw his the oil paintings of him in the hallways. He was there with me as I worked there, in a sense.
And let me just say, too, that, this was behind the scenes of the newspaper. The newspaper itself was scary enough. It referred to the NAACP as the National Association for the Agitation of Colored People. And it called Washington, D.C. the Negro capital of the U.S. And it was just an incredibly hostile environment towards anybody who believed in civil rights or really any element of society that we would consider to be pretty standard by today's time.
I know that you suggest the comparisons to today from what you wrote about in that time. Shortly before I left my office this afternoon, I noticed something on the web that said that the congressman from Texas has been identified as one who said to Obama's face, "I can't stand to look at you." And I thought it was interesting when I read about Dealey was that Dealey not only said this to the president about him riding Carolyn's tricycle, but then he had it published in the Dallas Morning News. And I wondered how people reacted to, you would think that a conservative public would be offended by that level of discussion of the president and would be concerned about the presidency, if not the person. And so how did the people of Dallas respond to what their newspaper publisher said?
It's hard to quantify. We don't have really statistics. Of course, that would be the best way to prove it. But that folks supported it. But anecdotally over time, I think there really was a sense that folks were not moving in complete concert, complete agreement with that level of stridency, and it was part of a cloth. And people in Dallas were very embarrassed that folks had frankly attacked Lady Bird Johnson, rushing up to her, grabbing her gloves off her hands, throwing them in the street, in the gutter, spitting at her, trying to hit her. And I think they saw this as another extension and example. There was another key element that was going on. Dallas is one of those cities that lays claim to the title of being the buckle of the Bible Belt, there's probably a few Buckles out there, other cities that also claim that title, but the most powerful preacher, Baptist preacher in America, happened to be headquartered in Dallas, W.A. Criswell. He was the leader of the largest Baptist congregation in the nation, and he had a pretty vigorous record in the 1950s as being opposed to big government enforcement of desegregation. He had gone around the country assailing folks who were advancing integration as infidels, and that they were going to die from the neck up, he said. Infidels will die from the neck up. But when he found out about this guy Kennedy, running for office, he began speaking from the pulpit and writing a lot of sermons and about, and I'm going to use a term here, an exotic religion called Roman Catholicism, and that was just fascinating. I think now, long forgotten, really. We think a little bit about a term today that I hear, in the news, Islamophobia. Back then, I would call it, Roman Catholic phobia. He was really afraid, and this is the most powerful, influential spiritual preacher, spiritual leader in Dallas. He just had the largest congregation. Reverend Billy Graham, by the way, was a member of his congregation. And he set the spiritual tone, or maybe even the moral tone in the city. He loathed Kennedy. From a political perspective, but then he believed that he was practicing this exotic religion that would put the United States at the mercy of the papacy, that there was some, conspiracy afoot. And he said that if Kennedy was elected, true Christianity would be submerged in the United States, and that we would be in risk of this political collapse and this spiritual collapse. So you had all of these folks, and it's really to try to answer your question. It's very difficult to quantify the influence that would have. If I picture myself going to church on Sunday and hearing a sermon from this very convincing, thundering preacher. There's a reason it was a full house. He was really good at what he did. But he's basically telling you that Kennedy's a socialist who's going to, if he's elected and remains in office, he'll essentially eradicate the very religion that we're here practicing on this Sunday. So there was this sort of sense that things were getting out of control in different levels of the city.
Well, I have a lot of other questions that I could ask you, but I know that there are people out in the audience who would like to ask questions, so we'll stop here and see if any of you have a burning question. There's a microphone back there that if you would go to it, and then we can all hear your question.
Hi, I look forward to reading your book. Ben Barnes makes an observation in his book, Barn Burning, about whether or not Ralph Yarborough had a role in putting Kennedy in the motorcade. Wonder if you addressed that, or am I giving something away?
No, we just didn't address that in the book. Yeah,
And
but
from what we saw at the time, the Kennedy people, they were the ones really directing all of that.
Right.
It came from the top down. That's how they did their political visits.
Also looking forward to reading the book.
Great.
My question has to do with writing about basically events 50 and plus years later, and the topic being homosexuality in America at the time, and some of the prominent people turned out to be gay later, this sort of thing. Was this something that you feel like you could address? And how do you peel back the layers of time and put that in context?
it's a really good question. Do you want to? It's about.
Yeah,
Well,
it was-
it circles back to General Walker, and I'll let Steve explain that.
Yeah, it was something that we wanted to really address about General Walker, but not necessarily sensationalize about General Walker. But he was a guy from Texas who went off to West Point and was a terrible student. He was, I think, one of the bottom 2 or 3 in his class. And then during World War II, turned out to be a hell of a damn good Nazi killer. He was, volunteered for what seemed like suicide missions, parachuting behind enemy lines and killing a bunch of Germans. And he rose through the ranks pretty quickly. And Walker became a very prominent general when Eisenhower called in the military to desegregate the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, some of you may know about that. Guess who the general was who got that call? It was Walker. He went in there, his troops put their bayonets on the end of their rifles and just trotted through the streets, pushing people out of the way. A few people got hurt, but Walker didn't care about that. And so here's a guy who was, and then he went off to Germany where, his troops had, nuclear arms and everything. And he started getting involved with the John Birch Society. He began to think really that, as Birchers do, that there was an international communist conspiracy to undermine the United States. Even Dwight Eisenhower was part of that conspiracy. And part of that conspiracy was racial integration. And so Walker began to think that, my God, Eisenhower sent me to integrate Little Rock, and so I was his unwitting tool for the forces of socialism and communism. So that's kind of when he became a little bit nuts, you might say, and started indoctrinating his troops with the John Birch Society literature, got counseled about that a few times and kept doing it, and then it broke out to the open, and that's when Kennedy relieved him of command. And then Walker went through all these other kind of misadventures. He was arrested for sedition and insurrection, by the way, but on Kennedy's personal orders. We have those Oval Office transcripts, too, that we used in the book. And we looked at Walker's FBI files, which are pretty voluminous. And, there was never any mention of him being gay or anything like that in any of those papers. And so we never could really tell for sure how much people knew at the time. Certainly there were reports that he was a very eligible bachelor in the military, but seemed to have no interest in the many women who came to dance with him at social functions and things like that. But it was really, I think in the mid-'70s when he started getting arrested more than once for basically fondling undercover policemen in public restrooms. So, and I don't know if I answered the question at all, but it was hard to put all that into his sexuality into context without knowing, and we didn't know enough about it really, so we sort of alluded to it.
Right. Yeah. The manifestation. I get on manifestation. There were just a lot of rumors, about him that were circulating around, and we didn't want to really linger, with rumors, and just sort of spelled out his story and the culminating events, where he was arrested and saw where that went. He was just an incredibly fascinating figure. He was on the cover of Newsweek as, again, the titular head of the title said "Thunder on the Right," and it had this picture of him on the cover. He was really the leader of the anti-Kennedy movement in America, headquartered in Dallas in a two-story mansion off Turtle Creek Boulevard again. And one thing that is just mind-blowing, he was also on the front page of the New York Times at one point in the fall of '62 when he left Dallas basically with a small army of followers, including, he was supported by members of the American Nazi Party, and it was this real interesting, intense, ragtag, vitriolic group. They were going off to Mississippi, to the University of Mississippi, to essentially instigate riots hoping to thwart the efforts of James Meredith to begin the integration of Ole Miss, the university there. And it turned out to be an enormous, black eye, and I think in American history. So a few people died. Thousands of troops had to be sent at the order of Kennedy to, as Steve said, to stop General Walker from Dallas, Texas, who was leading an insurrection. There was a sense in the White House when we read the transcripts that the nation was really in turmoil. There was it was under attack. He sent troops, thousands of them. I forget.
It's like a second civil war breaking out almost.
15,000 troops, I think, was the figure, and they basically invaded down there to restore order. And Walker was out in front of these people. We tried to write this in a very, vigorous way to really just convey the danger. But he was out in front of people, these crowds, saying, "Riot, riot, riot." And some people died. He was arrested at the orders. Bobby Kennedy, who was advising his brother, of course, as Attorney General. They were having these incredible, frantic phone calls and reports in the White House. It was really almost a war room in Washington. What do we do about Walker? What do we do about him? We need to intercept him. We need to arrest him. We need to take him away. And they did. They put him in a psychiatric facility where he was held, really just way out of public view. Some people came from Dallas to spring him. It was just an amazing moment. When he was on his way to Mississippi, one of his followers, one of the members of this army that he had, was stopped. And when the police took a look at his car, it was just crammed with weapons. Thousands of rounds of ammunition, high-power weaponry, and they were really getting out of control. And the reason I bring all of this up is that Walker clearly had another life. He had this other life that he must. My wife was telling me when she read the book, she said, she said, I almost feel a sense of pity for him because perhaps he had this other personal life out there that ran so counter to so many things that he purported to stand for, ardent Christianity and so forth. I tried to disavow her of her pity for him, but that was more of a different discussion.
We have another questioner.
Yes, it sounds like you kind of steer clear of the typical conspiracy theories and even the assassination itself. Your book's really not about the assassination, it's about the milieu of Dallas, correct?
Yes.
But you bring up something about Lee Harvey Oswald that I'd never heard before, and I don't know if this has been reported, this attempted assassination attempt. And it just is very curious to me.
Right.
How does he go from?
Right.
Is it the theory of polar extremes?
Bipartisan.
Yeah. I guess you'd call it that. But how does that happen? And get a little more on the attempted assassination. Was he found out, or was it? That's something that came out later. Did Walker know about it?
Yeah.
Maybe it's like, well, you want to kill somebody, kill this guy. Right?
Yeah. It's a great question.
Yeah, and that's a story that is pretty well documented. It's not necessarily widely known, but and what happened basically is that people say, well, Oswald is a communist, and my thinking is if he was a communist, he was a terrible communist. He went to the Soviet Union, pinnacle of communism, and couldn't take it, and he despised people who were in the working class. I mean, what kind of communist is that? And so really what we sort of saw of Oswald is that he was somebody who was quite troubled and unstable. He was a misfit. He had higher than average intelligence and felt that he was an important person who deserved to have a prominent place in whatever society he was in. And of course, in Dallas, he just kind of kept being cut out of things. And so he was a very frustrated person, had a lot of personal problems. And but as a nominal leftist, he certainly saw General Walker as a great danger. He certainly took the threat of Walker's fascist movement quite seriously and thought that he would be doing the country a great favor by killing this man. He told his wife, well, if somebody had stopped Hitler in time, it would have changed world history. And Oswald did take that shot at Walker. It passed through the general's hair and exploded into a pile of his anti-Kennedy literature. And Oswald, took several buses back to get home, and nobody really knew what had happened. We've seen in the archives the general thought it was an inside job. There were double agents working for him and so forth, and there were all these investigations that led nowhere. But after Oswald, was arrested and the police went through his things, that's when they saw the note he left to his wife the evening he went to go try to kill Walker. They saw his photos at Walker's house and parts of his operations manual for that.
Mm-hmm. So. Oh yeah, he had maps and escape routes that led to some pretty conclusive evidence and statements from his wife as well that he was out to kill, that he regretted not actually killing Walker, that he was upset that it hadn't happened. So as Steve said, it's been documented but kind of forgotten. He buried his gun, and after he fled the scene, he had really cased out the place, and it was really this rising tide that was going on. That was in April of '63. And so to try to answer your question as well, though, you know what, my theory on it is that he was a very malleable and impressionable person. I'm not I'm hardly even an armchair psychologist, but I would never use the word inspired, but I might use the word influenced. If you're existing in this hothouse environment and you feel, he was watching all these people in Dallas who presumed to be agents of change. Fascinating city. I love Dallas. I loved living there. And even during the time when I was there in the 1980s, I felt that Dallas always felt, you know what, we could play on the national stage and the international stage. And why shouldn't they? You know, why shouldn't folks there be able to do that? And I think that's what was happening back then. You had, you know, preachers and businessmen and politicians and newspaper magnates saying, you know what, we could influence the course of American history and international history. And the republic is in danger and we need to step forward and we're just going to do it. We built this city out of nothing. There's no reason for Dallas to exist. I often say it. It emerged. It was willed into existence, you know, on the prairie by some you know, entrepreneurial people. And I think in that environment, you have this impressionable guy who really wanted to be have his stamp in history. He really regretted that when he defected to Russia, that it didn't make true international history and news. It was kind of overlooked and forgotten, and he kind of slunk back to Dallas. Coincidentally, about the same time that General Walker returned to Dallas from his fateful, you know, Army mission in Mississippi, and so he moved into an action plan, and I think he just lingered and lingered and lingered and said, I still need to take action in some way, and was in.
It makes a lot of sense that
Yeah.
that would be kind of a dry run for the.
Could be, yeah.
Especially since he got away with it.
Yeah.
But he went through the whole plan,
Yeah.
and it's not unusual to have wide swings like that.
We have another questioner who's waiting at the microphone.
It's tall, sorry. I'm not a Texas native, but I'm very interested in reading your book. My question is about when you were investigating at Hogwarts. You said that you encountered a lot of racially charged language, and that it made you very afraid to be in the mind of this person or these people who were very committed to these thoughts. Did it make it difficult for you to write it, or did you have to detach yourself from it because you felt you wrote it in present tense and felt like you were reporting it? Did it inspire any kind of debates between the two of you?
You're such a good reporter. Those are really good questions. I feel like, could you please come take my classes at UT? I will give you an A. But you know, I worked in this building. I would see this oil painting of this guy that I, you know, was now writing about. I worked at the Dallas Morning News for 20 years. And you know, maybe this is a self-indictment. Maybe I wasn't that good of a reporter because I wasn't aware of some of the mindsets that were prevalent, even in the, you know, the marrow and DNA of the building where I worked. So that's where it kind of scared me. I had my hunches and feelings that there might have been some folks addicted to, quote, Southern traditions, which is really a polite way of talking about racism, you know, and for our discussion, I think. And so that's what kind of scared me. It was just, what I mean by scared was the level of almost openness. What you had was the publisher of the paper dictating letters to his secretary in which he was using the N word a lot, and it just talking about people in Washington, talking about people in Texas that way, and it just, I just was surprised, and then I'd say scared. Maybe it was just, you know, I felt like people were listening. The walls were listening to me. It was just, you know what I did that was, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but you know, I was allowed to photocopy some of these things, and then when I went home back to Austin, I called back to the library and I said, would you re-photocopy some of these things for me again, because that way you'll have them too, and that way, well, everything will be, you know, really triple verified in a sense. It was kind of a strange thing to do, but I felt that important, and we talked about it, and I wasn't excited to find that. It's not I think I was, you know, both a little frightened in a way by some ghosts that were lingering. It's 50 years ago, but it's not that long ago, and you know, I happen to be a journalist. So I believe that, journalism, despite some evidence to the contrary, can occasionally be a force for good and maybe even, balance. And I felt that that kind of mindset from the top down, it probably was not setting a tone for the very place that I went to work for later on.
And let me just say, too, that Ted Daly's archives are so fascinating because usually when people are like that, they're on the wrong side of history. A lot of times you'll see them go through and scrub their papers before they turn them over to some kind of public institution.
Right.
And Ted Daly was so sure he'd be vindicated by history, he just turned over everything. He was proud of it. And
Yeah.
to me, that's kind of
Yeah,
terrifying.
that's really true.
Another questioner?
In reading the book, the radio program Lifeline and the Dan Smoot Report, could you comment, do you believe this is actually the beginning of hate radio in America? And secondly, when both of y'all were doing your research, how many times did you come across the name J. Evetts Haley?
Yeah.
Too many times.
I'll let you go. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say that, I wrote a biography of J. Frank Dobie, who had a very close friendship at one time with J. Evetts Haley, and they broke apart over politics. But I had no idea to what, I didn't really pursue Haley's story, but certainly encountered him this time. When General Walker was in Mississippi whipping up resistance to federal government, guess who was in the car with him? J. Evetts Haley. J. Evetts Haley is the guy who came to Dallas to speak at one of the meetings of the National Indignation Convention. And the speaker before Haley had said that Chief Justice Earl Warren should be impeached, for his anti-U.S. rulings, with integration and so forth. Well, Haley got up there and he said, well, my compadre here has turned moderate. He only wants to impeach Earl Warren. I'm for hanging him. So, yeah, he was kind of a colorful character to look at and was involved in a lot of that. But do you want to take the rest? What was the other part of your question?
Lifeline.
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
the
right.
Hate radio.
Dan Smoot. And,
That's a short answer. Yes, that's the invention of right-wing talk radio. It espouses a lot of hatred. Yeah.
It reached 10 million listeners, daily, and yeah, it seemed to be the first real big exposition of that kind of, extreme radio. Yeah.
This is probably a good point for us to stop so that those of you who do want copies of the book and want to get them autographed, those of you who are looking for Christmas presents not long away, they'll be glad to.
Books make great gifts.
Yes. I'd like to thank our panelists.